The first time Louis Fletcher noticed the woman kneeling beside the grave, he told himself it was none of his business, clicked his tongue at his mare, and kept riding. That was in the early spring of 1874, when the Kansas prairie was still brown and brittle from winter, and the sky hung low and gray like a wool blanket someone had forgotten to shake out. Louis rode the same road every morning, a hard-packed dirt trail that cut between the eastern edge of the Callaway grazing land and the smaller homestead plots that dotted the valley below Broken Spur Ridge. He rode it because it was the most direct path between his ranch and the town of Harlow Creek, and he was not a man given to taking the long way around anything. The homestead he passed was modest by any measure. A two-room clapboard house with a sagging front porch, a garden plot that someone had clearly worked hard to maintain, a small chicken coop, and a barn that leaned just slightly to the left as though it were listening for something. The property was hemmed in on the north side by a stand of cottonwood trees, and it was near those trees, perhaps 30 yards from the road, that the grave sat. He had noticed the grave before he had noticed the woman. It was a simple mound of earth with a wooden cross, the kind every family on the frontier seemed to have somewhere on their land. He had not given it much thought, but on that gray March morning there was a woman kneeling beside it, and she was pressing something into the soil around the base of the cross with her bare hands. Louis kept riding. He told himself again that it was none of his business. He told himself the same thing the next morning when she was there again, and the morning after that. By the fourth morning, the curiosity had become something heavier than idle wondering, though he still could not name it. He watched her from the road as he passed a slender woman with dark hair pinned under a plain bonnet, working the soil with a patience that seemed out of place in a season that had not yet decided whether it wanted to be alive. He could not see her face clearly at that distance. He could only see the careful, deliberate way her hands moved, and the small, deliberate distance she kept from the world. He kept riding. The weeks passed the way they do in Kansas in the spring, slowly at first, and then all at once. Louis had enough to occupy him. His ranch, the Triple Creek, was not the largest operation in the county, but it was his, and he had built it largely on his own, which meant that every fence post and water trough and square foot of grazing land carried some particular history of sweat and stubbornness. He ran 300 head of cattle, employed 4 hands, and spent most of his days doing the kind of work that left a man tired enough to sleep without dreaming. He was 34 years old, unmarried, and had been told more than once by more than one person that he worked too hard and talked too little. He did not disagree with either assessment. He had simply not yet found a reason to change either habit. Then, one morning in late April, he rode past the homestead and stopped his horse dead in the road. The grave was surrounded by sunflowers. Not fully grown, they were seedlings, maybe 6 inches tall, their small faces still learning which direction to point, but they were everywhere. Planted in a careful ring around the mound of earth and the wooden cross, row upon row of them, a deliberate and vivid intention written into the ground in the language of seeds and soil. Even at that early stage, with the flowers barely formed, there was something about the sight that caught at something in Louis's chest and would not let go. He sat his horse for a long moment, looking at the ring of seedlings and the grave they surrounded, and the question formed in his mind with an insistence that surprised him. Why sunflowers? He did not ask it, not that morning. He clicked his tongue at his mare and he rode on, and he carried the question with him into town and through the errands he needed to run and back out again in the afternoon, and it was still there when he sat down to supper that evening, quiet and persistent as a splinter. He asked around town, carefully and casually, the way a man does when he does not want to admit that he is curious. He learned that the homestead belonged to a woman named Sadie Vaughn, that she had come to the valley 2 years ago with her husband, a man named Thomas Vaughn, who had died the previous autumn of a fever that had swept through the valley like a bad rumor, that she had no family in the territory, that she kept to herself, that she had managed to hold onto the property through the winter, which several people mentioned with a note of surprised respect, as though they had not quite expected her to survive it. He also learned, from a passing comment made by the clerk at the general store, that Sadie Vaughn was 27 years old, and that she had a stubbornness about her that could strip paint off a barn door if she directed it at one. Louis filed all of this away and told himself again that it was none of his business. But the sunflowers kept growing. By mid-May they were knee-high, thick-stemmed and reaching, and the ring around the grave had become something else entirely. It had become a statement, a declaration made in yellow and green against the flat brown Kansas landscape. Louis could see them clearly from the road now, and every morning when he rode past, they were a little taller, a little more insistent, a little more impossible to ignore. He started leaving earlier in the mornings so that he would pass the homestead while the dew was still on the grass, and the light was that particular shade of gold that the prairie only managed for an hour or so before the sun climbed too high and burned it away. He told himself this had nothing to do with the sunflowers or the woman who had planted them. He was not a convincing liar, even to himself. One morning in the first week of June, he rode past and she was there, weeding between the plants, and she straightened up and looked directly at him. He had not been close enough before to see her face properly, and for a moment the directness of her gaze startled him. She had dark eyes, he could see that even at this distance, and a kind of stillness about her face that made him think of the surface of a lake just before a wind came up. Not placid, exactly, just waiting. He raised a hand from the saddle in a brief, awkward greeting. She looked at him for a moment longer, then turned back to her weeding without returning it. Louis Fletcher, who had built a 300-head cattle operation through sheer force of will, and had once stared down a bull for 10 straight minutes until the bull gave up and walked away, felt heat rise in his face and rode on considerably faster than he had intended. He thought about stopping the next morning. He thought about it the morning after that. He thought about what he would say. He turned over phrases in his mind with the same thorough dissatisfaction he brought to any task he could not quite get right. He was not a man who was comfortable with conversation that did not have a practical purpose. He was not sure that asking a widow why she had planted sunflowers around her husband's grave constituted a practical purpose. But the question would not leave him, and the image of those tall yellow flowers would not leave him, and eventually, on a warm morning in the second week of June, with the sky a hard, bright blue above the Kansas plain, and the sunflowers fully bloomed and facing east toward the rising sun, Louis Fletcher pulled his horse off the road and rode across the dry grass toward the homestead. The flowers were extraordinary up close. They stood perhaps 5 feet tall now, their faces wide and frank and unashamed, and they formed a complete ring around the grave that was dense enough to block the view of the wooden cross from certain angles. The effect was less like a decoration and more like a shelter, as though the woman had built the flowers around the grave the way you would build walls around something you wanted to protect. He dismounted and tied his mare to a fence post at the edge of the garden, and he walked toward the grave with his hat in his hands, because it seemed like the right thing to do. Sadie Vaughn was on her knees between 2 of the taller plants, working a small trowel into the soil with quick, practiced strokes. She heard him coming. He was not a quiet man, and the ground was dry, and she looked up. This close, he could see her face clearly for the first time. She was younger than he had pictured from across the road, or perhaps it was just that she looked less like the idea of a widow and more like a real person when you were standing 10 feet away from her. Her face was sunburned across the nose and cheekbones. Her hands were stained dark with soil, and she was looking at him with an expression that was not unfriendly, but was not yet welcoming either. It was the expression of a woman who had learned to be careful about what she let in. "I ride past here every morning," Louis said, which was not the opening he had planned but was the one that came out. "I know," she said. "Bay mare, you leave around sunup most days." He was surprised enough that he almost fumbled his hat. "You noticed?" Hard not to notice the same man on the same horse on the same road every day, she said simply. She did not say it unkindly. He stood for a moment, holding his hat and feeling the full weight of his own awkwardness. I had a question, he said finally. I figured it was none of my business. I rode past anyway. I apologize for the intrusion. She sat back on her heels and looked at him steadily. What's the question? He looked at the sunflowers, at the way they stood so deliberately, so densely in their ring around the grave, and he looked back at her. Why sunflowers? Something shifted in her face. It was not quite surprise, and it was not quite pain, and it was not quite the thing people call grief, though it was close to all three. It was more like recognition, as though she had been waiting for someone to ask that specific question and had not been sure anyone ever would. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "They were the first thing Thomas ever gave me, before we were married. He rode 3 hours to get them because I mentioned once that they were my favorite. Came back with a whole armful, covered in dust from the road, and he just walked up to where I was standing on my father's porch and held them out like they were something ordinary." She paused. They weren't ordinary. Louis was quiet. "He's buried here because this was his land," Sadie continued. "He worked so hard for this place. I wanted him to have something here that was beautiful, something that came back every year." She looked at the flowers, and the expression on her face was one of the most complex things Louis had ever seen on a human face. Sunflowers always come back if you take care of them right. Louis Fletcher stood in the Kansas sunshine with his hat in his hands and felt something in his chest that he did not have a name for, but that was, he suspected, the beginning of something important. "They're remarkable," he said quietly. "The flowers, they're remarkable." She looked at him then, really looked at him as though she were weighing something. "I'm Sadie Vaughn, Louis Fletcher. I run the Triple Creek northeast of here." "I know," she said again. She almost smiled. "It's a small valley," he nodded. He put his hat back on his head and looked at the grave for a moment, at the wooden cross visible above the ring of yellow faces, and he felt the appropriate weight of being in the presence of someone else's loss. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Vaughn. He did good work on this property." Something about the plainness of that, not the hollow condolences she had probably received 100 times, but the specific acknowledgement of what Thomas Vaughn had built, made her eyes go soft for just a moment. "He did," she said. "Thank you for saying so." Louis nodded again and walked back to his horse, and he rode away with the feeling that something had been opened that was not going to be easy to close again. He did not stop the next morning, because he did not want her to think he was making a habit of intruding. But the morning after that, he noticed that the gate in her fence, the small wooden gate on the east side of the property, near the road, was hanging badly off its upper hinge, listing at an angle that would have it dragging the ground within a week. He stopped. He told himself it was because he was a practical man who could not ride past a broken gate without noting that it needed fixing. This was partially true. He tied his mare and walked up to the gate and looked at it. The upper hinge had pulled away from the post on one side, old wood, probably softened by winter moisture. It needed a new piece of timber and some heavier hardware. He went to the house and knocked. Sadie answered the door in her work clothes, a plain dark dress, an apron, her hair still loose because it was early, and she looked at him with a wariness that he thought was reasonable and probably well-earned. "Morning, Mrs. Vaughn. Your east gate is about to fail. Upper hinge has pulled free. If you've got some spare timber and hardware, I can fix it before I go to town." She stared at him for a moment. He got the impression she was deciding something. "I have timber in the barn," she said finally. "Come through." He fixed the gate. It took the better part of an hour because the post itself needed attention, and once he was into it, he found 2 other things nearby that needed doing: a section of fence rail that was cracked through, and a post at the corner that had heaved up from a freeze and needed resetting. He did these things without being asked and without comment, because they were there and needed doing. When he was finished, Sadie came out of the house with a cup of coffee and held it out to him. He took it. They stood at the fence in the morning light, and the conversation came easier than he had expected. Or perhaps it was not quite conversation, more like two people standing in the same space and letting the silence between them be comfortable. She asked about the Triple Creek. He told her about the herd, about the difficulty of finding good water on the east pasture, about the hand he'd had to let go in the winter because the man had a temper that made him dangerous around the horses. She listened with the same careful attention she gave to everything he was starting to notice. He left when the coffee was gone. He thanked her. She thanked him. He rode to town feeling unreasonably good about a gate hinge. He came back 3 days later with a sack of nails and a length of good timber he'd had left over from a repair on his own barn, because the wood in her fence was clearly older and softer than it should be and would need more attention before winter. He told himself this was neighborly behavior. This was also partially true. Sadie accepted the materials with a directness that he appreciated. No excessive gratitude, no awkward refusal, just a simple, "I'll put that to good use," that told him she understood the transaction for what it was. She was not a woman who needed to be coddled, and she was not going to pretend she did not sometimes need help, and both of those things he found deeply respectable. He started stopping more regularly. Not every day. He did not want to impose, and he was genuinely busy, and there was something about the measured pace of these visits that felt right, the way you let bread rise slowly because rushing it ruins it. But 2 or 3 times a week he would find some reason to stop. A fence that needed mending, a question about the road conditions east of the valley, sometimes just the coffee, which she offered without fanfare and which he accepted without making too much of it. He learned things about her, the way you learn things about someone when you are not asking directly, in pieces and fragments, accumulated like sediment. He learned that she was originally from Missouri, that she had come to Kansas with Thomas Vaughn 3 years ago, full of the particular optimism that the West seemed to inspire in people who had not yet met it in a difficult mood. He learned that she could drive a wagon better than most men he knew, that she kept meticulous accounts of every penny that came in and went out of the household, and that she had taught herself to repair almost everything on the property out of sheer necessity in the months since Thomas died, with varying degrees of success. He learned that she loved her land with the same quality of love she had applied to those sunflowers, patient and stubborn, and entirely without sentimentality, the kind of love that plants things and tends them because you believe in the fact of their growing even when the season is hard. He also learned that the land itself was in trouble. He gathered this gradually from small things, the way she hesitated before mentioning the cost of seed, the careful calculations she sometimes did in her head before agreeing to a purchase at the general store when he happened to see her there, the way the house needed paint and the barn needed roofing, and she was clearly prioritizing necessities over anything that was merely desirable, which meant she was operating on a thin margin. He did not say anything about this directly for a while. It was not his business, he reminded himself, and he was still not sure of the ground between them. But there was a Saturday afternoon in July when he rode past and saw that her cow was stuck in the dry creek bed at the back of the property. He could hear it bawling from the road, and he went in without knocking and found her already knee-deep in the creek bed, trying to lever the animal out by herself with a long branch, covered in mud, and clearly had been at it for some time. Between the two of them, with ropes and patience and a great deal of talking, to direct it at the cow, they got the animal out in about 20 minutes. Sadie stood on the bank covered in creek mud and looked at her rescued cow, who was now acting as though nothing had happened, and she said something very precise and very unladylike about the animal's intelligence and lineage. Louis laughed. He had not laughed like that in a long time, a real laugh, spontaneous and full, the kind that surprised him. And when he looked at Sadie, she was laughing too, in spite of herself, in spite of the mud and the exertion and whatever else was sitting on her shoulders that day. And in that moment he saw something in her that was not the careful, watchful woman who weighed every word before she spoke it. He saw someone who was genuinely funny and who, when surprised out of her caution, was as warm and vivid as the flowers she had planted. He drove back to the Triple Creek that afternoon and spent the evening at the table with his accounts, but his mind was not on the numbers. He was aware that he was falling in love with her. He had been aware of it for some weeks, in the way you are aware of something you are not yet ready to deal with peripherally, cautiously, keeping it in the corner of your vision. But the laughing by the creek bed had moved it to the center of his vision where it could not be ignored, and he sat at his table for a long time turning it over in his mind with the honesty he applied to all difficult problems. She was a widow. She was grieving. She was managing a property and a life on her own. The last thing she needed was a man complicating her situation. He was also fairly certain that she liked him, in at least the ordinary sense of the word. She had stopped being wary of him. She talked to him now with an ease that he valued deeply, and sometimes in the mornings when she brought out the coffee, she would lean against the fence post and talk with him for longer than the situation strictly required. And once or twice he had caught something in her expression when she looked at him that was not grief and was not mere friendliness. But he did not know how to do this, and he did not want to do it wrong. He decided to be patient. It was his best quality, he had been told, and it was the only tool he trusted in a situation where he could not see the fence lines clearly. There was, during this time, a complication that had nothing to do with the heart. Harlow Creek in the summer of 1874 was a town in the process of deciding what it wanted to be. The railroad was pushing through the territory, and everyone knew that where the railroad went, money went, and where money went, other things followed, some of them useful, some of them not. There was a man named Cal Driscoll who had been buying up land in the valley for the past 2 years, quietly at first and then less quietly. He ran a cattle operation east of Louis' Spread and had interests in 2 of the businesses in town. And he had a way of looking at other people's property that reminded Louis of a man calculating the price of something he intended to take. Driscoll had already made 3 approaches to Louis about buying the Triple Creek. Louis had refused each time with decreasing politeness. What Louis learned in late July from a conversation with the county clerk who had been a friend of his for many years was that Driscoll had also made an offer on Sadie Vaughn's homestead. She turned him down flat, the clerk told him over a drink at the saloon. From what I heard, she was not particularly nice about it. Good, Louis said. The clerk looked at him sideways. Driscoll doesn't tend to stay turned down, Louis. I know what Driscoll tends to do. He rode home that evening with an unease he could not quite settle. He had dealt with men like Cal Driscoll before, men who interpreted every boundary as a negotiating position, and every no as merely an opening bid. The difference was that he had a full crew and a well-established operation, and the kind of legal footing that came from having a good attorney and never missing a debt payment. Sadie Vaughn was alone and operating on a slim margin. He decided to stop by the next morning and mention it, casually, the way you mention weather or road conditions, just information offered as one neighbor to another, no implication that she could not handle her own affairs. He stopped by and she was already in the garden when he arrived, and he tied his horse and leaned on the fence and said, I heard Cal Driscoll made you an offer. She looked up at him from among the bean rows. He sent a man 2 weeks ago, offered half what the land is worth. That's his opening position. It was also his closing position, she said. I told his man that I was not selling and that if Mr. Driscoll sent anyone back to my property, I would introduce him to my rifle. Louis considered this. Do you actually have a rifle? Thomas's Winchester, she said. I know how to use it. He believed her completely. I wanted to mention it because Driscoll can get persistent. I wanted you to know that if he becomes a problem, there are people in this valley who will stand with you. She straightened up and looked at him directly. People, she said. He said, and the word came out plainer and more direct than he had intended, and he saw something move across her face, not quite surprise, but awareness, the way a compass needle swings. I appreciate that, she said after a moment. She said it quietly, and there was more in it than the words. He nodded and pushed off from the fence. I'll let you get on, the beans are looking good. They are, she said. She was watching him as he walked back to his horse, and he could feel it, and he rode away with the particular charged feeling of a man who has said something real and is waiting to see how it lands. It landed slowly, the way the best things do. August came with full heat, the kind that pressed down on the prairie from above and radiated back up from the cracked earth, so that the whole valley shimmered in a constant haze. The sunflowers were at their peak, great tall columns of yellow and brown, 5 feet high, standing in their ring around the grave with an authority that made people slow down when they drove past on the road. Louis had heard 2 different people mention them in town, always with a note of wonder. You see those sunflowers out at the Vaughn place? And the other person would say yes, they had seen them, and there would be a pause that meant both people were thinking about the same thing without saying it. Louis thought about them often. He thought about the story behind them, the young man who had ridden 3 hours to bring flowers to a girl on her father's porch, and he felt for Thomas Vaughn a complicated kind of respect that included grief on behalf of a man he had never met. He also thought, with increasing frequency and honesty, about Sadie. He thought about the way she moved through her work, the efficient, unself-conscious physicality of a person who had learned to depend on their body and had made peace with it. He thought about the way she talked, choosing words with care but not with affectation, always meaning exactly what she said. He thought about the rare moments when something surprised a laugh out of her, and the way her whole face changed when that happened. All the careful guarding dropped for a moment. He thought about these things in the evenings, sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee and watching the day end over the western hills, and he thought about the fact that he was 34 years old and had never felt quite this particular kind of specific weight about any person in his life. He was not entirely sure what to do with it. The timing felt delicate. She was barely a year into her widowhood. He did not want to rush anything, and he did not want to make her feel cornered, and he was afraid, though he would not have called it fear out loud, of saying the wrong thing and losing the easy companionship that they had built, which was already something he valued far beyond its nominal description as neighborly. He resolved again to be patient. Then, in the 3rd week of August, Driscoll's patience ran out before his did. It started with a fence. Sadie came to town that Wednesday morning, and Louis saw her when he was coming out of the hardware store, and he could tell from 20 feet away that something was wrong. She moved differently when she was angry, tighter, more contained, like a coiled spring, and she was moving that way now, heading for the land office with a piece of paper in her hand and a set to her jaw that could have cut glass. He fell into step beside her. What happened? Driscoll's men put up a fence line overnight, she said, without breaking stride. Across the north corner of my property, I have the survey map. The fence is 6 feet inside my boundary line. He's trying to force a dispute, Louis said. He's trying to force me off, she said flatly. I'm going to speak to the county surveyor, and then I'm going to ride out to Driscoll's operation, and I'm going to make very clear to him exactly what I think of his fence. I'll come with you, Louis said. It was not a question. She stopped and looked at him. They were on the boardwalk in front of the land office, and the morning sun was full on her face, and there was that compass needle quality to her expression again, awareness, adjustment, recalibration. You don't have to do that, she said. I know I don't, he said. I want to. Another moment of looking at him with that careful directness. All right, she said. The county surveyor confirmed what she already knew. Driscoll's fence was 6 feet inside Sadie's legal property line, and the surveyor would put that in writing and file it with the land office that same day. Armed with this, Sadie and Louis rode east to Driscoll's operation. Cal Driscoll was a large man in his mid-40s with the kind of broad, well-fed face that comes from years of eating well at other people's expense. He received them in front of his house with his foreman at his shoulder and the particular smile of a man who has already decided how a conversation will end. Mrs. Vaughn, he said, ignoring Louis entirely. I imagine you're here about that fence. Survey error, most likely. My men will look into it. The county surveyor has already looked into it, Sadie said. She held out the filed document. This confirms the fence is on my land. I want it down by Friday. Driscoll glanced at the document without taking it. You know, he said, his tone shifting to something that was meant to sound reasonable but was actually condescending. A woman alone managing all that property, it's a lot to take on. My offer still stands. Good money, clean transaction. You could start fresh somewhere easier. The fence, Sadie said, down by Friday. Driscoll's eyes moved to Louis, cold and calculating. Fletcher. Driscoll, Louis said, you got a stake in this. The lady said what she came to say, Louis replied. I'd take her meaning seriously if I were you. The land office has that document now. Anything that happens to her property from this point is on record. Driscoll's smile stayed in place but didn't reach his eyes. He looked between them for a moment, then back at Sadie. Friday, he said. The fence came down on Thursday. Riding back from Driscoll's that afternoon, Sadie was quiet for a long stretch of road and Louis did not push. He had learned that she needed space to process, that the quiet was not a withdrawal but a kind of settling like soil after rain. Finally she said, he will try again. Probably, Louis agreed. But he'll try a different way next time. He doesn't want a legal fight. It costs money and draws attention. He prefers people to give up quietly. I'm not quiet, she said. No, Louis agreed. You're not, she glanced at him. That wasn't a complaint, he added. She almost smiled. I know. They rode in comfortable silence for a while longer. The heat of the day was beginning to ease, and the light was going long and golden across the grass, and the prairie smelled of dry earth and sun-warmed sage, and Louis thought that he was happy, in the full simple sense of the word, in a way he had not been in a long time. Thank you, Sadie said eventually, for coming. You had it handled, he said. I did, she agreed. But it mattered that you were there. He looked at her. She was looking straight ahead down the road, her profile clear against the wide Kansas sky, and there was color in her cheeks that was not entirely from the sun, and he thought, now perhaps, not today but soon. And he let himself carry that thought the rest of the way home without examining it too closely. September came in cool and clear. The kind of fall weather that the Kansas prairie managed once in a while as if to apologize for the summer. The sunflowers had begun to turn, their faces going heavy and downward as the seeds developed, the green of the stems darkening toward brown, but they were still there, still standing in their ring, still beautiful in the changed way that things are beautiful when they are going to seed rather than going to bloom. Sadie told him once that she harvested the seeds in the fall and stored them to replant in the spring, which meant the ring around the grave was perpetually renewed, year after year. He helped her with the fall harvest in the second week of September. It was, by this point, entirely natural for him to show up on certain days and put his hands to work alongside hers. He had helped her repair the roof of the barn in August, a full day's work that had required both of them and had ended with a shared supper on the porch, the first time he had eaten with her, and he had gone home afterward feeling the evening like something warm stored in his chest. The harvest was a bigger undertaking: wheat, beans, corn, root vegetables, and Louis brought 2 of his ranch hands along to help, which meant the work was done in 2 days instead of 5. On the second evening, when the hands had ridden back to the Triple Creek, and Louis was sitting on Sadie's porch with a cup of coffee and the particular satisfied exhaustion of good physical work completed, she sat down in the other chair, and they watched the stars come up over the cottonwood trees, and the conversation went somewhere it had not quite gone before. She talked about Thomas. Not in the guarded way she usually did when his name came up, but more freely, the way you talk about someone when you are beginning to be able to hold their memory without it breaking you. She talked about the particular sound of his laugh and the way he had always overestimated how much he could carry in one trip, and the morning they had first seen this land together, riding out from town on borrowed horses, and Thomas saying, "This is the one, Sadie, this is the one right here," with absolute certainty, before they had even made it to the creek. Louis listened. He did not offer comparisons or try to fill the silences. He just listened, because she needed to be heard and because he was a good listener, and because the particular combination of love and grief in her voice was something he wanted to honor with his full attention. When she stopped talking, the silence was a different quality, softer, more open. "He sounds like he was a good man," Louis said. "He was," she said. "Not perfect, stubborn as a mule about certain things, but good." "The best people usually are stubborn about something," Louis said. She looked at him sideways. "Are you saying that about yourself as well?" "I am deeply aware of my own stubbornness," he said, with enough gravity that she laughed, and there it was again, that full, warm laugh, and the night settled around them with a sense of ease that felt like permission. He did not say anything more that night. He said good night, and he rode home under the stars, and he lay awake longer than usual, not with anxiety, but with the quiet, full feeling of a man who is in the right place at the right time and knows it. 3 days later, he came by in the morning and she was at the grave. Not working, just standing there, among the seeding sunflowers, her hand on the wooden cross, and there was something in her posture that told him it was the anniversary of something. He sat his horse at the fence line and did not go in. He did not want to intrude, but he did not ride away either. After a few minutes she looked up and saw him, and he raised his hand in the same brief greeting he had offered months ago on that morning in March, and she nodded, and that was all, but it was enough. He went home and came back that afternoon with a jar of his housekeeper's apple preserves and left them on her porch without knocking, because sometimes what a person needs is to know that someone is thinking of them without needing anything in return. He found a note on his fence post the next morning. It said, "Thank you. The preserves were excellent and I ate more of them than I should have." He kept the note. He folded it small and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. This was, he recognized, the behavior of a man who was entirely gone on someone. He decided that he needed to say something. The thought of saying something frightened him in the specific, particular way that only things that truly matter are frightening. He was not afraid of difficult conversations. He was not afraid of hard work or bad weather or stubborn cattle or men like Cal Driscoll. But the prospect of saying what was true to Sadie Vaughn and not knowing how she would receive it was a different kind of challenge altogether, and he respected it as such. He spent several evenings preparing, which for him meant sitting quietly and thinking until the thing had a shape he could work with. In early October, on a cool, clear morning when the cottonwood leaves had gone gold and the harvest fields were bare, and the sky was the particular deep blue that meant the first hard frost was not far off, he rode to the homestead and asked Sadie if she would walk with him. She put down the butter churn she had been working and looked at him with the measuring quality she had about her, and said yes. They walked along the fence line to the north of the property, where the cottonwood trees made a corridor of gold light along the dry creek bed. The morning was very still and very beautiful, and their boots made quiet sounds in the dry grass, and Louis thought, "Now," he said, "I want to say something. I want you to let me say it through before you respond, because I have been practicing and I will lose my place if I stop." She looked at him with something between amusement and seriousness. "All right." He looked straight ahead at the cottonwood trees. "I know you're still finding your footing. I know Thomas has not been gone a year yet, and I know what you're building here on this land is your own thing and doesn't need anyone else to tell it what to be. I want you to know I understand all of that, and nothing I am about to say is intended to push past any of it." He paused, collected himself. "Over the past 6 months I have come to feel about you in a way that I have not felt about anyone in my life. I am not going to dress it up or make it into something more complicated than it is. I care for you. I think about you most of the time when I'm not with you. I want to be near you as much as I'm welcome to be. That is the truth of it, and I thought you deserved to hear the truth of it plainly because you are a person who deserves plain truth." He stopped. He looked at her. She had stopped walking and was looking at him with an expression he could not fully read, something serious and still, and very much in the present moment. She was quiet for long enough that he began to feel the particular vulnerability of a man who has said something real and is standing in the open waiting. Then she said, "I've been trying to figure out what to do about you for 2 months." He blinked. "About me?" "About the way I feel about you," she said, and her voice was steady but her hands were not entirely still. "Which is not a simple feeling. It is complicated by the fact that I am still carrying Thomas. I think I will always carry Thomas." "That is just the truth. I know that," Louis said. "And it is complicated by the fact that I have spent this past year building something entirely my own, and I am not willing to give that up or have it altered." "I know that too," he said. "I would never ask you to." "I know you wouldn't," she said. "That is part of why this is," she paused, searching for the word, "not simple." He waited. She looked at him steadily, and he saw it clearly now, what had been moving behind her expression for months, the thing she had been managing and measuring and keeping careful. It was not absence. It was the opposite of absence. "I don't want you to stop coming," she said. "I want you to keep coming." She stopped, and the stillness of her face broke open just slightly, and what came through was something completely honest and completely unguarded. "I want more of what we already have," she said, "and I think what we already have might be the beginning of something very good, if we are both willing to let it grow at its own pace." Louis Fletcher stood among the gold cottonwood leaves in the October morning, and he felt the full relief of something settling into its right place. "I am very willing," he said. She looked at him for a moment more, and then she did something he had not expected. She reached out and took his hand, just held it, there in the corridor of trees, her fingers intertwined with his. And they stood like that for a moment in the quiet morning, and it was simple and serious and very, very true. They walked back to the house still hand in hand, and she made coffee, and they sat on the porch in the October sunshine. And the conversation was both entirely different from what it had been before and exactly the same, because what they had built over those months of coffee and fence repairs and morning greetings was still there, still the foundation, and what was new was simply the acknowledgement of where it was leading. The following weeks were the best of Louis's life up to that point. He found himself discovering the particular joy of courtship conducted between two adults who already know each other well. There is a clarity to it, a shorthand, a comfort that courtship between strangers never has. He knew how she took her coffee, and what made her angry, and how she moved when she was tired, and what she looked like when she was genuinely delighted by something. She knew his habits and his silences, and the particular set of his shoulders when something was bothering him. What was new was the permission to mean more to each other than they had been allowing themselves to mean. He brought her things, not extravagant because that was not the right language between them. A good length of rope she had mentioned needing. A book of botanical illustrations he had seen in the window of the general store and known immediately she would love. Once, a small jar of honey from a neighbor's bees which he left on her porch with a note that said, "The bees know a good thing when they find it." She left him notes in return. Short, dry, precise, occasionally funny, entirely like her in every sentence. He kept them all in the inside pocket of his jacket until the pocket was genuinely full, and then he kept them in a tin box on his bedside table. He met her formally as his intended before the valley, as it were, at the church social in mid-October, where he appeared at her side and made no secret of it, and the resulting conversations in the community ran the full range from warm approval to cautious comment. But the dominant note was warmth, because Sadie Vaughn had earned a good deal of respect in the valley over her year of surviving it, and Louis Fletcher was known as a man of his word and good standing. There was one older woman at the social, a Mrs. Eleanor Pace, who had been in the valley since before most of the current residents were born, who took Louis's arm as he was getting a cup of punch and said quietly, "That is a remarkable woman you've got there, Louis Fletcher, and don't you ever take a remarkable woman for granted." "I know it," he said. "Good," she said, and patted his arm and walked away. November brought the first hard frost, and then the first snow, and the sunflowers at the grave were bare brown stalks by then, dried and still. But Sadie had harvested every seed in September and stored them in small cloth bags that she kept in a cool corner of the barn, labeled in her careful handwriting. Louis had helped her do it, the two of them working through the ring of flowers on a warm September afternoon, filling bag after bag with seeds. It had felt like a ritual, though neither of them named it as such, the preservation of something that would come back in the spring, year after year, rooted and faithful. He asked her to marry him in November. He did not make a grand event of it. He asked her on a Sunday afternoon when she was baking, and he was sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the contentment of a man in exactly the right place. He said, "I would like to ask you to marry me, not to change what you have here, but to add to it. I want to build a life alongside you, on this land and mine both, and I want to grow old in the same direction as you." She stood at the kitchen table for a moment with flour on her hands and looked at him with those dark, steady eyes, and he thought she might cry, but she didn't. She said, "Yes, on the condition that we live here at least part of the year, because I am not leaving Thomas." "I would not expect you to," Louis said. "We can go back and forth between the properties until we figure out the right arrangement." "Then yes," she said. "Yes, Louis." He stood up from the table and he crossed to her, and he cupped her face in his hands, flour dust and all. And he kissed her for the first time, and it was warm and slow and very deliberate, and she kissed him back with the same quiet certainty with which she did everything. They were married in the first week of January 1875, in the Harlow Creek Church, with the snow lying clean and white outside, and the church heated by a wood stove that the congregation had maintained for 20 years. The ceremony was performed by the reverend who served the valley's small congregation, and the church was as full as it could reasonably be given the weather, because the valley had taken a collective interest in the proceedings. Louis stood at the front of the church and watched Sadie walk up the aisle in a dress the color of warm cream that she had sewn herself, with her dark hair pinned up simply, and a small bouquet of dried sunflowers in her hands, the only flowers available in January, preserved from the autumn harvest, and he felt in his chest the specific gravity of a moment that is exactly what it should be. She was composed and clear-eyed and beautiful, and she stood beside him and said the words with a steadiness that made the Reverend smile, and Louis said his words in return and meant every one of them to the bone. There was a supper afterward at the community hall. Mrs. Pace had organized it, as she organized most things worth organizing in Harlow Creek, with roast beef and corn bread and a truly extraordinary amount of pie. And Louis and Sadie sat together at the center of the long table and ate and talked and received congratulations from the people of their community. And it was warm and noisy and full of life. And Sadie was laughing at something the man across the table had said, and Louis looked at her and thought, "This is the beginning." He was right. The spring came slowly and then all at once, the way it always did on the Kansas prairie, and with it came the work of settling into a life that was now a joint undertaking. They had worked out over the winter an arrangement that suited them both. They spent the majority of their time at Sadie's homestead, which meant a great deal to her, and which Louis had grown fond of for his own reasons. And Louis's ranch hands managed the Triple Creek under the direction of his most senior hand, a steady man named Abel who had been with Louis for 6 years, and was more than capable of the responsibility. Louis rode out to the Triple Creek most mornings, the same ride he had been making all along, down the same road, and returned most evenings, and the rhythm of it suited them both. In late March, on a warm afternoon that smelled of thaw and new grass, they planted the sunflowers together. Sadie had her cloth bags of seeds, carefully stored through the winter, and she knelt beside the grave with a small trowel and began pressing them into the soil in the pattern she had established, the careful ring, row by row, the same deliberate distance between each seed. Louis knelt beside her and helped, following her lead, working around the circle in the other direction so that they met at the back of the grave. He paused at the wooden cross, It was weathered now, 2 winters old but solid. He put one hand briefly on the top of it, a gesture that surprised him even as he made it, and then he went back to the planting. Sadie watched him do that. He knew she watched him do that. He looked up and their eyes met and she said nothing, but she reached over and put her hand over his briefly, right there in the soil beside the cross, and then she went back to work. The sunflowers came up in April, small and certain, and by May they were knee-high and climbing. Louis found that he watched them with a particular affection that had changed from the original curious fascination. It was something more personal now, because he had pressed those seeds into the earth with his own hands, and because he understood now what the flowers meant, the full story of them, and because they were part of the landscape of his home. In the spring of 1875, Sadie was with child. She told him on a May evening on the porch, matter-of-factly, watching the sunset over the western hills, her voice steady but her hands wrapped around her coffee cup in a way that told him she was managing a great deal of feeling under the steadiness. He took the cup from her hands and set it on the porch railing, and he took both her hands in his and looked at her. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am," she said. "I am very all right. I'm also," she paused, "I am full of something I don't have a word for yet." "We don't need a word for it yet," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, which was something she did rarely enough that it always carried particular weight when she did. "I want to do this right," she said. "We're going to do this right," he said, and he meant it with everything in him. The summer of 1875 was the best summer Louis Fletcher had ever lived. He was aware of this while it was happening, which he understood was unusual and valuable. Most people only recognize their best summers in retrospect, when they are older. He was 35 years old and married to a woman he loved profoundly, and they were building a life together on a piece of land that meant something to both of them, and the sunflowers were 6 feet tall by July, taller than they had ever been, Sadie said, as if the soil had gotten better. The soil had gotten better. They had worked it together, added compost, rotated the kitchen garden, improved the drainage on the north side of the property. The homestead that had sagged slightly under the weight of one person managing everything alone was beginning to straighten up under the care of two. The barn was fully re-roofed. The house had fresh paint, a warm cream color that Sadie had chosen after much deliberation. The fence was solid all the way around. The garden was the most productive it had been since Sadie arrived. Cal Driscoll had not appeared again, which Louis attributed partly to the fact that Sadie's situation was now visibly less precarious, and partly to the fact that Louis had made certain conversations available to Driscoll through mutual acquaintances. Conversations that made clear that any further attempts to acquire the Vaughn property would encounter significant organized resistance from several families in the valley. Louis had built those alliances quietly over the winter because he believed in preparation. Driscoll had backed off. He was still in the valley, still accumulating, but he had moved his attention elsewhere, and Louis intended to keep it that way. Louis Jr. was born in November of 1875. He arrived on a cold night with the first serious snow of the season falling outside and a fire going in the kitchen stove. And he arrived with the healthy indignation of a boy who had opinions about the world from his first breath. The midwife who attended them, a practical woman named Mrs. Garland who had delivered half the children in the valley over 20 years, pronounced him strong and good-sized and entirely fine, and handed him to Sadie, who held him with that same quality she brought to everything important, utter attention, and a kind of love so focused it was almost fierce. Louis sat beside her on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, who was very red and very opinionated and very small, and he felt something open in his chest that he did not have a name for and did not need one. "He looks like you," Sadie said. "He looks like a very angry potato," Louis said. Sadie laughed, exhausted and genuine and warm, and their son opened his eyes at the sound of her laugh, and they were wide and dark like hers, and Louis thought, "There it is. There is the center of everything." They named him William Thomas Fletcher. William for Louis's father, who had died when Louis was 20 and whom he had missed all his adult life. Thomas for Sadie's first husband, because the name belonged in the family, and because Louis had understood from the beginning that loving Sadie meant holding space for what she had loved before him, and he did not resent it, not a single day. The valley received news of the birth with the warm collective interest that small communities bring to new life, and there was a stream of visitors over the following weeks bearing food and useful gifts, and the particular loud wisdom of experienced parents, all of which Louis and Sadie received with gratitude, and the occasional shared glance of barely suppressed amusement. Mrs. Pace came on the third day. She held William for approximately 30 seconds, looked at him with the authority of a woman who had formed an opinion about every person she had ever met, and said, "Good. Strong boy. You'll have your hands full." Then she put him back in Sadie's arms and sat down and had coffee and told them 2 stories about the valley's history that Louis had never heard before, and left with the air of a woman who had accomplished what she came to do. The winter of 1875 into 1876 was hard, the kind of winter Kansas produced when it was not feeling charitable, with storms that kept them in for days at a time and cold that got into the bones of the house. But they were warm. They had enough wood, enough food, enough of everything that mattered. William grew with the dedicated efficiency of a healthy infant. Sadie recovered her strength and then some. Louis read to her in the evenings. They had accumulated a respectable number of books between them, and she mended and nursed and managed the household accounts with the same meticulous care she brought to everything. And sometimes they talked late into the night with the lamp turned low and William sleeping in his cradle by the fire. And these were conversations of the kind that you can only have with someone you know entirely and trust completely. He told her things he had not told anyone. About the years of building the ranch alone, the specific loneliness of it, not dramatic but constant, like a low-grade weather. About his father and about the mistakes he had made in his 20s that he would not make again. About the way he had been afraid before her, that he was someone for whom the solitary life was simply the natural condition, that he had been built for work and not for closeness. She listened to these things with full attention and no judgment, and she said once, very quietly, "I'm glad you were still there when I arrived in this valley." "So am I," he said. He had never meant 2 words more. She told him things too. About her childhood in Missouri, about the parents she had loved and lost young, about the years of trying with Thomas to make the land work, the hope and the effort and the grief when the fever took him so fast and so finally, leaving her alone on a half-built homestead in a valley full of strangers with a winter coming, and no one who had any reason to help her. And then the rancher who rode past every day finally stopped, she said one evening, with a dry note in her voice that made him look at her. "Is that how you think of it?" he asked. "No," she said. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and her touch had the same particular quality it always had, deliberate, specific, meaning exactly what it meant. "I think of it as the morning the right question got asked." He turned his hand over and held hers. "Why sunflowers?" he said. "Why sunflowers?" she agreed. The spring of 1876 brought the flowers back. It always did. Sadie planted the new seedlings in March, as she did every year, and Louis was beside her in the soil with his hands, and William sat propped in the sun near the garden in the particular boneless contentment of a healthy 5-month-old, watching the world with those wide, dark eyes, and the cottonwood trees along the creek were going green, and the sky was enormous and blue and full of moving clouds. Louis looked up from the planting and looked at Sadie, at the sunburn on her cheekbones, and the dark hair coming loose from its pins, and the absolute absorption she brought to pressing each seed into the earth, and he thought of the first morning he had stopped. The question he had carried for weeks before he finally asked it. The ring of seedlings, knee-high and learning which direction to point. He thought of everything that had grown from that morning. The gate hinge and the coffee and the creek rescue and Driscoll and the cottonwood trees in October and the note about apple preserves in his jacket pocket. the flower on her hands when he asked, the dried sunflowers in her wedding bouquet. William, opinionated and strong and named for both of his fathers. He thought of the grave and the wooden cross, and the man buried there who had ridden 3 hours for a handful of flowers for a girl on a porch, who had chosen this land with absolute certainty and had not been wrong about it. And he felt toward that man the same complicated respect he always did, mixed now with something that was almost like gratitude. Thomas Vaughn had built this place and had loved it and had loved Sadie with the best of what he had, and the fact of his love and his care and his presence, written into the land and into Sadie and into the wooden cross and the sunflowers that returned every year, was not something that diminished what Louis had. It was part of it. It was woven into the fabric. He understood that now in a way he had not fully understood at the beginning. Loving Sadie did not mean competing with memory. It meant being large enough to hold the whole of her, every year of her life, every person she had loved, every seed she had pressed into the earth. It meant being the man who stayed, who showed up, who asked the right question and was willing to wait for the full and careful answer. "You're not planting," Sadie said, without looking up. "I was thinking," he said. "You can think and plan at the same time," she said. "That's debatable," he said, and she looked up and laughed, and he went back to pressing seeds into the earth. The summer of 1876 was long and good. The cattle operation at the Triple Creek had its most productive year yet. The homestead garden was extraordinary. Sadie had always been a capable gardener, but with the improved soil and the better infrastructure they had built, the harvest that fall was more than enough to see them through the winter with a surplus to sell. The sunflowers were extraordinary, as they always were, the great ring of them burning bright in the August heat. A neighbor, a young woman named Clara, who had recently settled on a property 3 miles down the road with her husband, stopped one afternoon to ask about the flowers. She had seen them from the road and been curious, she said, looking at the ring around the grave with wide eyes. Sadie told her the story, all of it, Thomas and the armful of flowers and the 3-hour ride in the grave and why she had planted them. Clara listened quietly, and when Sadie was done, Clara said nothing for a moment, and then she said, "That is the most loving thing I think I have ever heard." Sadie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He was a very loving man." Louis, who was on the other side of the yard working on something with a fence post and not meant to be listening, heard this exchange and said nothing. He let Sadie have it, that moment of pure, uncomplicated love and grief that was hers. He went back to his fence post and let the afternoon go on around him and felt the full weight of his gratitude. That October, on the 2nd anniversary of Thomas Vaughn's death, Louis made a small thing happen that he had been thinking about since early summer. He had commissioned quietly, from the best woodworker in Harlow Creek, a new cross for the grave. Not to replace the old one, which Sadie would never have agreed to, but to stand beside it, a taller, better crafted piece of oak, with Thomas Vaughn's name and dates carved into it cleanly, and below those 2 lines, a single phrase that Louis had chosen carefully, that Sadie had told him Thomas used to say, "This is the one right here." He set it in the ground beside the original cross on the evening before the anniversary, while Sadie was inside with William. He did it alone, quickly, with a post digger and good timber, and the particular care he brought to things that were important. On the morning of the anniversary, she went to the grave, as she always did, and he stayed at the house with William and watched from the porch. He saw the moment she saw the new cross. He saw her stop completely. He saw her hand come up to cover her mouth. She stood there for a long time. He could not see her face. When she came back to the house, her eyes were red and she was composed in the particular way she was composed when she had been crying and was done with it, and she stood in the doorway and looked at him, and he looked back at her, and she said, "Louis," just his name. But the way she said it held everything that needed saying. He crossed to her and she put her arms around him, and he held her there in the doorway with the Kansas morning coming in around them, and she said into his shoulder, "That was the right thing. That was exactly the right thing." "I thought so," he said quietly. She pulled back and looked at him, and her eyes were dark and clear and full of the complicated, layered kind of love that is only available to people who have lived enough to understand what they have. "I love you," she said. It was not the first time she had said it. They had been saying it to each other for many months now, but it carried a specific weight this morning. "I love you," he said. "All of you, every part." She held his face in her hands for a moment, the way he had once held hers on the day he proposed, flower and all, and she kissed him once precisely. And then she stepped back and straightened her dress and went inside, because William was calling and there was breakfast to make, and the day had to go on. Louis stood in the doorway for a moment, looking out at the two crosses against the morning sky, and the bare stalks of the sunflowers standing sentinel in their ring, seeds harvested and stored for another spring. He thought about the question that had started all of it. He thought about how a question can be a door, if you ask it with genuine curiosity and wait for the full answer. The years that followed were full and good in the way that full and good years are, not dramatic, not without their difficulties, but with the particular texture of lives being built by people who are paying attention. The Triple Creek grew, and the homestead flourished, and the valley around Harlow Creek changed in the ways that the West was changing in those years. The railroad came through in 1877, bringing the town new energy and new faces, and the usual complicated mixture of opportunity and disruption that modernity tended to bring to frontier places. Sadie, characteristically, adapted. She began selling surplus produce to the growing town market, and within 2 years had established a small but reliable income from the garden operation that was entirely her own achievement. Louis watched this with the specific pleasure of a man who loves a capable woman and knows better than to get in her way. In the fall of 1877, William, who was not quite 2, began to talk with the focused intensity of a small person who had been storing words up for months and was now prepared to deploy them. He said mama and pa and no with equal conviction, and he had his mother's eyes and his father's stubbornness, and a laugh that stopped whoever was in the room. In 1878, Sadie was with child again. This one was slower coming into the world, and the labor was hard enough that there were some frightening hours in the night when Louis sat outside the bedroom door with his hat in his hands and prayed in the plain, unsentimental way of a man who does not pray often, but means it thoroughly when he does. Mrs. Garland was inside with Sadie, and there was nothing he could do, and the helplessness was specific and physical. Then there was a new sound from the other side of the door, small and insistent, and Mrs. Garland opened the door and said, "She's fine, Louis, and you have a daughter." He went in and Sadie was pale and exhausted and entirely herself, and she was holding the baby girl with the focused attention she brought to everything, and she looked up at him and said, "She has your nose." "That is unfortunate for her," he said, and Sadie laughed, which was the most relieved he had felt in a long time. They named her Rose, for the particular spring morning she reminded them of when they looked at her, and for no more complicated reason than that it was the right name for her. William took the arrival of his sister with philosophical 2-year-old incomprehension for approximately a week, and then decided she was acceptable, and began directing her education with considerable authority for a child who was not yet fully toilet-trained. Rose, for her part, regarded her brother with the same wide dark eyes their mother had, calm and assessing and entirely unimpressed by nonsense. By the spring of 1879, the homestead had a full household of 4, a prosperous garden operation, well-maintained livestock, and 2 solid partnerships. The one between Louis and Sadie, and the one between the homestead and the Triple Creek, which operated as a single economic unit now even though they remained technically separate properties. The sunflowers went in every March as they always had. Louis and Sadie planted them together, as they had done since his first spring on the property. It was by now a ritual as fixed in their year as harvest and branding season, the 2 of them on their knees in the March mud, pressing seeds into the ring of earth around the grave, and the 2 crosses side by side, weathered and solid. William helped now, pressing seeds in with his small, serious hands and asking his father questions that required complete answers. Rose, in her second spring, grabbed seeds and tried to eat them. On one of those March mornings, when the air had the particular clarity of early spring, and the prairie grass was just beginning to go green at the tips, Louis found himself pausing in the planting and looking at the scene, his wife in the soil, his son beside her, his daughter bundled in a small chair at the edge of the garden watching everything with the profound attention she brought to the world. And he felt the full weight of it, the specific gravity of a life that is entirely what it should be. He looked at the graves. He thought about Thomas Vaughn. He thought about a young man riding 3 hours for flowers and a girl on a porch, and the land they had come to together full of the West's particular optimism. He thought about the winter that had taken Thomas and the season that had followed, and a woman surviving it by pure stubbornness and dignity. He thought about a gray March morning and a figure kneeling in the cold, pressing things into the earth with bare hands. He thought about a question. He pressed a seed into the soil and thought, "Thank you." Not to anyone specific, or perhaps to everyone who had been part of the sequence that led to this morning. To Thomas Vaughn for loving Sadie enough to leave her someone worth being. To the Kansas prairie for producing enough hardship to ensure that nothing was taken for granted. To some arrangement of fortune or grace that had sent him down that road at that hour on that morning instead of taking the longer way around. Sadie looked up from her planting and caught him looking at her. "Thinking again," she said. "Thinking again," he agreed. "About what?" He looked at the sunflower seeds in his hands, small and dark and entirely ordinary except for what they became. "About how everything starts with a question," he said. She looked at him for a moment with those steady dark eyes, and a smile moved across her face, small and real and entirely specific to him. "Why sunflowers?" she said. "Why sunflowers?" he agreed. She turned back to her planting with the same small smile still on her face, and William asked a question about something and she answered him, and Rose made a sound of concentrated interest at a passing sparrow, and the morning was blue and cold and full of new grass smell, and Louis pressed the seeds into the earth one by one, faithful and patient as the season. The sunflowers came back that spring, as they always did. Tall and frank-faced and unashamed, turning toward the light with a simplicity that was its own kind of wisdom. Sadie cut a few in late July and put them in a jar on the kitchen table, and they filled the house with yellow light. She harvested the seeds in September and labeled the cloth bags in her careful handwriting, and stored them in the cool corner of the barn for the next March. Year after year, faithful as the season. Year after year, the ring around the grave, bright and deliberate and full of intent, speaking in the language of seeds and soil and the particular love that plants things not because it knows the outcome, but because it believes in the fact of their growing. Louis Fletcher, who had once been a man too busy for the long way around, learned from his wife the particular value of deliberate, patient love that returns in the spring, love that tends the difficult ground, love that asks the right question and waits for the full and careful answer. He learned it from her every day. And every day, riding out in the morning toward the Triple Creek, he passed the sunflowers and he thought of the first morning he stopped, and the question that had started everything, and the life that question had grown into, and he was grateful with his whole heart for having asked it. There is a particular kind of morning on the Kansas prairie, in the late summer when the sun is still low, and the light is gold, and the whole wide country is spread out ahead of you, that makes a person feel the specific rightness of being alive in a particular place at a particular time. Louis Fletcher knew that feeling well. He had known it since the first year he had built the Triple Creek, that sense of the land as something personal and responsive, something that gave back in proportion to what you put into it. But it was better now. It was better with Sadie beside him in the mornings, and William's voice from inside the house, and Rose's particular laugh, and the sunflowers in the south corner of the property standing in their ring around the grave of the man who had first loved this land. It was better with a life made deliberately, with a woman who brought to every single thing she touched the same quality of full and unashamed attention. The rancher who had ridden past every day had finally stopped. And everything that mattered had grown from that stopping, the way the best things always grow slowly, stubbornly, turning toward the light.